Hi YouTube, this is Evie. Welcome back to my channel, and today I'm going to be talking about sex in BDSM, specifically whether or not BDSM has to be sexual. Now, the short answer is no, but I feel like it needs more explanation than that, so in this video I'm going to be covering why I believe that this idea has become popular, that BDSM has to be sexual, sort of the original roots of BDSM and how it was originally practiced, and then sort of how it has transformed over the years and why this idea has started to take shape. I believe there are three main reasons why people believe that BDSM has to be sexual. BDSM has become conflated with sexual fetishes and kinks. There are a lot of overlap between the two for sure, but the idea somehow that everything in BDSM is related to a sexual kink or a fetish is just wrong. There are a lot of kinks that are not part of BDSM, and there are a lot of parts of BDSM that aren't kinks. It's kind of like a Venn diagram. A good example of this is ABDL, which is Adult Baby Diaper Lover. You can see overlap with that into BDSM, but it is generally just a sexual fetish on its own, doesn't exist within the BDSM community. So, like ABDL, which can be a part of BDSM but is a sexual fetish all on its own, there are parts of BDSM that aren't also sexual fetishes. So, for example, you will see people who are into bondage and discipline, which can be a sexual fetish for some people, but it isn't always. The idea that people only participate in BDSM activities for the sexual gratification of them is just plain wrong. When BDSM was first starting to take hold in Europe and it was starting to develop its own community, bondage and discipline was one of the most common types of activities that you saw, and it wasn't usually sexualized. Even nowadays, when you see people who are professional DOMs who are providing services to people, usually sadomasochists, although sometimes also people who are into being tied up or people who enjoy discipline or humiliation, it's generally not a sexual thing for the DOM. And usually it's not meant to be a sexual release for the client either. It's actually relatively rare to have a professional Dom or a professional dominatrix who will allow the person they're providing a service to get off from it in their space. And it would be pretty hard to argue that a professional Dom isn't participating in BDSM when they're providing a service to a sadomasochist client. And neither one of them is getting off in the situation. Maybe the person who is a sadomasochist is, but the Dom certainly isn't. And in that sense, to the Dom, it isn't a sexual pleasure thing, it's a business. And again, in old guard style BDSM, it was not generally seen as sexual. Bondage and discipline were the really main core parts that made up the scene. And yes, there were sadomasochists involved as well, but that didn't really start to take over the community until a little bit later. And it didn't really start to become sexual until it was actually introduced to America. And to this day, in Europe and more European-styled BDSM, most people who practice this try to keep the sexual component of it very minimalized. Sex is seen as just one component of a BDSM relationship, but it's not the overall driving force of the relationship itself. And that leads me to my third point, which is the transformation of BDSM through Western and American media. Now, in the last 20 or 30 years, BDSM has become a lot more sexual, and that has to do with mainstream pornography or near mainstream pornography taking BDSM and using it for their productions. Kink.com is one of the most popular pornography websites out there, and besides Kink.com, there are probably dozens, if not hundreds, of derivative sites off of Kink.com that each tailors itself to a specific fetish or a specific part of BDSM. Now, if you watch anything on kink.com, you will learn that it is extremely formulaic, and there is a very certain way that people who make kink.com films are expected to make their production. And the topics that these videos cover are all extremely similar and all have an extremely similar plot line to them. And that's just also what porn is like in general, but at the same time, that's not at all what BDSM was traditionally like in Europe. And because of the fact that mainstream or near mainstream production companies were producing BDSM related pornography, it became most people's first introduction to BDSM. And of course, because this is pornography, a lot of it is extremely stylized and blown out of proportion. But it was also sort of the only way that people could really find out about BDSM, especially early on, because there really wasn't a lot of information on the internet. And if you weren't in a location that had a community already that had already introduced you to kink, it was kind of the only thing you had to go off of. So, of course, BDSM was going to seem extremely sexual. That's what pornography is about. It's about people experiencing and delivering a sexual pleasure to other people and to themselves. That's the whole point of pornography. And because America really likes hypersexualizing everything in general, of course, you're really not going to have any other representation of BDSM besides its sexual nature. No one's really interested in that unless they're already part of the BDSM community. Now, the interesting result of all of this inundation in popular media of BDSM being shown as an inherently sexual lifestyle is people are convinced that every single BDSM dynamic has to be sexual. I see a lot of people commenting back and forth on one another's posts, especially on Instagram or on anonymous messages on Tumblr, saying that pet play has to be sexual and that DDLG has to be sexual. And even if they admit that specific dynamics aren't inherently sexual, they are convinced that all of BDSM is a sexual lifestyle. And okay, I could see the argument that BDSM is a sexual lifestyle, but that's also assuming that BDSM is sexual for every single individual participant at all times. And that's again not true. There are a lot of asexual and gray sexual and other asexual spectrum people that participate in BDSM. And if you are somewhere along the asexual spectrum, you have a very limited to absolutely no sexual motivation for participating in BDSM. So, if BDSM is inherently sexual, why are asexual people participating in it? And the point that I want to try and make with all of this is that it's generally not a good idea to try and tell other people what their BDSM dynamic or relationship should be like. BDSM does not have a rulebook, and that includes whether or not it is sexual. It is completely up to the individuals themselves and the relationships that they're in. And really, unless it's impacting your own dynamic somehow, there's really no reason for you to make comments, judge people, or tell other people what to do with their own style of BDSM. Now, I'm sorry if this got pretty ranty or angry at any point. It's just something that I kind of hold close to my heart, especially because my own dynamic isn't usually that sexual, and so I get pretty personally offended when people try to tell me that BDSM has to be sexual because for me it isn't. But regardless of that, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up, and if you want to see more, please subscribe down below. I make videos twice a week, and of course, as always, leave any comments you want to, any questions you might have, or video suggestions. I love reading people's comments. And until I see you next time, I hope you have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. Bye bye.